He called me kid for 40 years. Redford let the words sit in the air, heavier than the silence filling the church. 2,000 people were waiting, but this wasn't for them. The casket sat close enough to feel real, close enough to remind him this was final. He could have gone on, could have said something safe, something expected. Instead, he stopped, and in that pause, the meaning of everything they'd been to each other quietly rearranged itself. Everyone there thought they understood the joke, the nickname, the teasing, the Hollywood shorthand for age and hierarchy. But standing there, Redford realized it had never been about humor or power. It had been private, deeply personal, hidden in plain sight. A single word that carried decades of trust, doubt, loyalty, and belief. He took a breath, feeling the weight of memory pressing forward. 40 years of conversations, late nights, arguments, encouragement, and unspoken reassurance all narrowed into this moment. Whatever he said next would do more than honor a friend. It would explain a relationship no one else had ever truly seen, and once spoken, it could never be taken back. It would land softly, but leave a mark lasting. He called him kid at first the way people do when they don't plan on it lasting. A casual label tossed out in conversation, light enough to laugh at and forget. Except it didn't fade. It followed him into interviews, onto sets, into phone calls late at night, and congratulations whispered after victories. Year after year, decade after decade, the word stayed exactly the same, even as everything else changed. On the surface, it sounded affectionate. People smiled when they heard it. Some even envied it, mistaking it for proof of closeness or charm. But beneath that smile was a quiet friction only the person wearing the name could feel. Because being called kid after a while stops sounding playful. It starts to feel like being frozen in someone else's memory, measured by who you were instead of who you've become. Most of us know that feeling, the nickname that lingers too long, the label that once fit but now feels tight. You outgrow it, but it refuses to grow with you. Every time it's used, you're reminded of an older version of yourself, smaller, less certain, still trying to earn the room. And even when the tone is warm, something inside you pushes back and wonders why it never changes. He pushed back too, sometimes joking, sometimes annoyed, sometimes pretending it didn't matter, yet it always returned, not louder, not harsher, just constant, a single word that refused to evolve, no matter how much success surrounded it. That constancy is what made it unsettling. If the name stayed the same, what did that say about how he was seen? Here's where the tension settles in, because when something harmless refuses to disappear, it stops being harmless. It becomes a question. Was it habit, control, affection, or something deeper that couldn't yet be named? The nickname lingered not because it was convenient, but because it carried unfinished meaning. And until that meaning surfaced, the word kid remained suspended between love and limitation, quietly asking why it had survived everything else. It lingered in the background of every achievement, creating a subtle imbalance between praise and recognition. Each success raised the same silent question: when do labels evolve? When does respect catch up with growth? That unanswered tension kept the story open, waiting for a moment strong enough to finally explain why a single word refused to let go entirely. He was young, untested, standing at the edge of a world that had already decided who mattered and who didn't. 32 years old, ambitious, full of hope, but heavy with the quiet fear that he might not belong. He had talent, yes, but talent alone doesn't earn trust, and in that room, across from him, sat a man who had already earned it 1,000 times over. 44, experienced, a name that carried weight and expectation, eyes that seemed to measure not only skill but character, and a presence that reminded you how much the world had already given him. And yet, in that first handshake, in that brief exchange of words, something unusual happened. The young man felt noticed, truly seen, not for what the world thought he could be, but for what he might become. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it planted a seed of belief in a heart that had begun to doubt its own worth.
The nickname came almost immediately, casual in tone, yet deliberate in timing. "Kid," he said. And it could have been teasing, it could have been condescending, but instead it carried warmth, a recognition that this person was starting his journey and that someone would walk alongside him, quietly rooting for him, even when the rest of the world might not. That small word became a lifeline, a thread connecting nervous beginnings to potential, a reminder that mentorship isn't always loud or obvious, that trust can be granted even before it is earned, and that guidance often comes disguised as humor or habit. And so the underdog learned to breathe a little easier, to take one risk at a time, to trust that someone of unquestioned authority had chosen to invest in him, and that his own journey, fragile as it felt, mattered enough to be guarded, encouraged, and sometimes challenged. That delicate imbalance between legend and newcomer, fear and faith, set the tone for everything that followed. Every glance, every word, every small gesture hinted at the depth of a connection that would unfold over decades, teaching that true respect begins in seeing potential before it is proven, and that the quietest acts often leave the deepest impressions. He had faced moments before when doubt crept in, when the weight of expectation pressed him toward retreat, when the voice in his head whispered that he wasn't ready, that he couldn't measure up. And yet each time the word returned. Kid. Not spoken with judgment or impatience, but with steady conviction, as if to say, "I see you, even when you cannot see yourself." At first, it was easy to mishear it, to dismiss it as teasing, a playful reminder of age or inexperience. But over time, it began to carry a different weight, one that seeped quietly into his bones. It became a small anchor, a single word tethering him to something larger than himself, something steady in a world that was constantly shifting. Every late-night call, every moment of hesitation, every whispered doubt met with that single, unwavering word reminded him that someone believed before proof was demanded, that faith could exist without accolades, and that recognition could be unconditional. Do you remember a time when a single word from someone else changed the course of your day or perhaps your life? That is what this nickname became, a quiet, persistent force. When he wondered whether he was making the right choices, whether the risks were too great, the word floated to the surface, reminding him that potential does not require immediate validation, that courage exists even when fear is loudest. It reframed every struggle, every uncertainty, transforming what once felt like limitation into reassurance, turning exposure and vulnerability into a space where growth could happen safely. What was once playful teasing now became mentorship itself, teaching that trust and belief often precede success, and that the measure of guidance is not in reward but in presence, and that the impact of encouragement is most profound when it arrives before you are ready to receive it. And so what began as a nickname became more than a name. It became a lifeline, a subtle, unwavering signal that he was seen, that his journey mattered, and that even in moments of self-doubt, someone held space for his potential. It was a word that reshaped identity, anchored ambition, and quietly insisted that fear need not dictate the limits of achievement. In those moments, the kid felt a truth deeper than any praise or accolade, that being recognized, believed in, and held by someone who truly sees you can become the foundation on which everything else is built. Why did he call me kid? The question had lived in his mind for decades, quiet at first, barely noticeable amidst the clamor of work, success, and life, but growing louder with each passing year. Every time the word slipped from his friend's lips, it carried a weight he couldn't quite define, a mixture of affection, authority, and challenge, and yet its meaning remained just out of reach. It was like a riddle spoken in laughter, a private code whose solution seemed tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly elusive. How could one simple word hold so much power, and why had it persisted when everything else had changed? Career, reputation, accomplishments, all of it shifted with time, but the nickname remained, constant, unyielding, and unresolved. He remembered the early moments when he had protested in jest, sometimes in irritation, but the reply had always been the same, a smile, a pause, and the word repeated as though it were a truth he was not yet ready to understand. For years he carried that tension quietly, letting it shape him in ways he only began to recognize in hindsight. Each phone call, each meeting, each reunion became a small test, a subtle reminder of both connection and mystery. And yet the unanswered question was never a source of anger, only curiosity, a pull toward comprehension that demanded patience, reflection, and trust. What did it mean to be called Kid after 40 years, and why had it endured through every success and setback? The unresolved nature of the nickname became its own lesson, teaching that meaning often reveals itself only when the time is right, that understanding can be delayed without diminishing its impact, and that the greatest truths sometimes wait in the spaces between words. It was in that waiting, that stretching of time, that the depth of friendship was most apparent, and the audience of his own life learned to watch, wait, and prepare for the moment when clarity would finally arrive. He looked down at the weight of the moment, the casket in front of him, the silence that stretched across hundreds of faces, and he felt the years fall into place all at once. For 40 years, the word had been tossed between them like a joke, a tease, a reminder of beginnings, but now it carried the full gravity of a lifetime. He said it aloud, slowly, deliberately, with a softness that held laughter and grief together, and in that one careful utterance, everything that had been unresolved, every question, every tension, every unspoken truth, finally found its home. It was not anger, nor bitterness, nor even triumph. It was understanding, rendered in a single word, a gesture precise enough to honor the past while shaping the memory of everyone listening. Why does one word hold so much power? Because it had been given and received across decades, layered with encouragement, challenge, belief, and quiet insistence. In that pause between syllables, the audience felt the weight of every conversation, every phone call, every late-night argument, and every small act of care that had quietly defined a lifelong friendship. The laughter that followed was not mockery, but release, a recognition of love hidden in persistence, of care that had been stern without cruelty, of devotion that had asked nothing and given everything. It was brutal in the gentlest way, a final lesson in trust, in recognition, in seeing someone fully and letting them know it without fanfare. And in that moment, grief and joy collided, leaving a collective breath caught between understanding and awe. The word was simple, but its meaning was infinite, a testament to the invisible labor of believing in someone long before the world does, and a reminder that the quietest gestures often leave the deepest impressions, shaping hearts, memories, and the way we choose to honor those who truly see us. The word kid was never just a nickname between two men. It was a mirror held up to the essence of who we all are at our most uncertain, most striving, most vulnerable moments.
Haven't we all been the kid somewhere, new in a place, doubting our worth, unsure if the world will recognize what we can become? That single word carried a promise, a preservation of possibility, a quiet insistence that someone sees the best version of you before you even fully see it yourself. It was belief rendered in syllables, a reminder that identity isn't only shaped by accolades, titles, or recognition, but by the eyes that choose to witness us fully, without judgment, without impatience. Think about the people who've called you kid or encouraged you with a single gesture that stuck long after the moment passed. What does it feel like to know someone believes in you, even when you're fumbling, even when failure seems imminent? That is the power embedded in these subtle acts, the quiet legacy of care, of attention, of seeing potential before it is proven. Redford learned that belief can be more enduring than fame, more transformative than success, and more intimate than any public accolade. The lesson reaches beyond the two men, beyond Hollywood, beyond history. It's a universal truth. To preserve someone's kid self is to grant them permission to grow, to fail, to rise again, to carry forward the version of themselves that dared to dream. And when we recognize that in our own lives, we begin to understand that every small act of trust, encouragement, and presence can ripple across decades, quietly shaping who we become, who we help others to become, and how we define the true measure of care, mentorship, and love. The nickname was simple, but its meaning was infinite, and its lesson belongs to all of us who have ever needed someone to see us as more than we yet know ourselves to be. If you stop and think about it, what does it mean to truly